Imagine this, a windswept summer morning, a lonely stretch of sand dunes where the ocean meets the forest. A family on a casual walk stumbles across what looks like a tattered blanket half buried in the sand. But as they draw closer, the sight freezes their breath in their throats. It isn't driftwood. It isn't trash carried in by the tide. It's a body. Face turned toward the sky, hands missing, hair spilling like dark seaweed into the sand. The woman is dressed neatly, almost elegantly, as though she had stepped off a city street just hours before. But here, in this desolate corner of the coastline, she has been left like a discarded secret. For nearly half a century, no one would know her name. No family to mourn her. No justice to claim her. Just a ghost of the dunes. Her story whispered in rumor, tangled in theories, entrapped in dusty police files. This is the story of the woman who vanished into the sand and the charming, dangerous man who destroyed her life. The year was 1974, the quiet coastal town of Seabury, Massachusetts, a quiet, postcard-perfect community framed by windswept beaches, weather-beaten cottages, and towering pine forests. To outsiders, Seabury looked timeless, a refuge far removed from the violence of the city. But that illusion would shatter on July 26th. A woman and her young daughter had gone for a walk along the dunes, a route popular with locals searching for seashells. The girl ran ahead, her laughter carried by the wind. Suddenly she stopped, pointing to something odd protruding from the sand. The mother at first thought it was a mannequin. That detail would later become a haunting refrain, repeated in news reports, whispered among neighbors. The body was posed so strangely, so starkly, that it didn't seem real. The woman was lying on a beach blanket, her body angled as though she had been resting in the sun. Her long auburn hair fanned out across the sand. Her hands were gone, severed at the wrist perhaps to prevent fingerprint identification. A crushed wound marred her skull, evidence of a savage blow. And there was more. Strips of blue denim had been tucked beneath her head, almost like a crude pillow. The medical examiner estimated she had been dead for about 2 weeks. But the strangest part? There were no signs of a struggle nearby, no defensive wounds, no tracks leading to or from the scene. It was as though she had simply appeared there, deposited in the dunes by some unseen hand. The town buzzed with fear and morbid curiosity. Who was she? A tourist who met the wrong person? A runaway who never made it home? Police began combing through missing persons reports across the state and beyond. But every lead collapsed into dust. The newspapers dubbed her the woman in the dunes. Some called her the mystery lady. She was faceless, nameless, a puzzle no one could solve. And while investigators worked tirelessly, the townspeople whispered their own theories. Some swore she was tied to organized crime, dumped after a mob hit. Others believed she had been murdered by a jealous lover or even a drifter passing through. But the truth, the real story of who she was and why she died was darker, more intimate, and far more tragic than anyone in Seabury could have imagined. For the detectives of Seabury, the case quickly became an obsession. They photographed the scene from every angle, bagged the strands of denim, scraped the sand for footprints that weren't there. They lifted fibers, tested soil, even checked local marinas in case the killer had come ashore by boat. Yet every clue dissolved like mist under the morning sun. Weeks turned into months. The town waited for answers that never came. The woman's body was laid to rest in a local cemetery under a plain headstone that read only, "Unidentified female, 1974. It became a marker people would visit out of curiosity, leaving flowers not for who she was, but for who she might have been. Over the years, the case file swelled into thousands of pages. Each new detective assigned to it brought fresh determination, only to run headfirst into the same wall of silence. Still, theories multiplied. Some believed she had been the victim of organized crime. The missing hands, the crushed skull, the eerie placement of her body. They looked to some like a warning. Maybe she had known too much, crossed the wrong person, or owed money to a syndicate that had quietly expanded into the harbor towns. Others clung to the idea of a crime of passion. Perhaps she had been killed by a jealous lover, someone who had once adored her but couldn't bear rejection. The denim pillow suggested a strange tenderness, as though the killer had both cared for her and destroyed her. Still others spun wilder tales. She was said to be an undercover agent, silenced by foreign spies, a runaway heiress fleeing family fortune, even a victim of a passing serial killer who had drifted through town undetected. Each new rumor fueled Seabury's folklore, turning the nameless woman into a legend as much as a tragedy. As the years passed, the case became less about solving a crime and more about enduring a haunting. Children dared each other to visit her grave after dark. Tourists asked locals for the story of the ghost in the sand, and for detectives, it was a wound that never healed. Twice her body was exhumed, once in the 1980s and again in the 1990s, each time with the hope that new forensic science could finally reveal her identity. Composite sketches were released, showing her with auburn hair and piercing eyes, then revised again as technology improved. Tips poured in after each release, dozens, sometimes hundreds, from people convinced they knew her. But the phone calls always ended the same way, with disappointment. The woman in the dunes remained as silent as the day she was found. By the time the new millennium arrived, many in Seabury had given up hope. The case had grown colder than the Atlantic itself. Detectives retired, evidence boxes gathered dust, and the nameless grave remained untouched by family. Yet the truth was still out there, waiting in the shadows of forgotten history. And one day, it would come roaring back with a name, a face, and a chilling connection to a man who had spent his life escaping justice. For nearly 50 years, the nameless woman of Seabury lay buried beneath layers of rumor, theory, and silence. But what no one in town could have guessed was that behind her mystery was a story far more ordinary and far more devastating. Before she became the woman in the dunes, she had a name. Let's call her Eleanor Wilder. Eleanor grew up in the rolling hills of the Carolinas, the kind of girl neighbors described as kind but restless. She had a wide, hopeful smile, auburn hair that shimmered in the sunlight, and an eagerness to make a life bigger than the one she had been handed. By the time she was in her mid-30s, Eleanor had already lived through hardship. She had known unstable relationships, had drifted from job to job, and had a longing to feel anchored, to feel chosen. Her friends often said she just wanted to belong to someone who wouldn't leave. That's when Charles Hammond walked into her life. Charles was older, tall, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the rules didn't apply to him. He had a way of filling a room, not just with his booming laugh and sharp wit, but with the intensity of his gaze. People said he could make you feel like the only person in the world when he spoke to you. Eleanor was swept off her feet almost immediately. Charles told her he was a businessman, a man with investments out west, always on the verge of some new opportunity. He flattered her, courted her, and promised her a life of excitement. Friends noticed how quickly the relationship moved. Within months, Charles was proposing marriage, presenting Eleanor with a modest but beautiful ring, and convincing her that he was the fresh start she had been searching for. And though her friends tried to caution her, to remind her of how little she truly knew about Charles, Eleanor believed she had finally found her place. In early 1974, the two married quietly, with only a handful of witnesses. The wedding should have been the start of a new life together, but those who knew Eleanor recalled an unease creeping in even before the ceremony. Charles was controlling, sharp-tongued when he didn't get his way. He had a temper that surfaced in sudden bursts, then disappeared behind apologies and gifts. After the wedding, Charles promised Eleanor a honeymoon trip along the Northeast coast. They packed her car, not his, but hers, and set off, smiling at neighbors as they drove away. That was the last time anyone in Eleanor's circle ever saw her. 2 weeks later, Charles returned alone. He told different people different stories. To some, he claimed Eleanor had run off suddenly, overcome with second thoughts about marriage. To others, he hinted she had fallen ill and had to go away to rest. But there was one detail that unsettled everyone. Charles was driving Eleanor's car. When asked where she was, he would shrug, grow distant, and change the subject. His explanations never quite lined up, but he carried himself with such authority, such smooth confidence that few pressed him. After all, Eleanor had always been restless. Maybe she had really just left. What no one realized then was that Eleanor's body was already lying in the dunes of Seabury, her hands severed, her identity erased. Had anyone looked closer, they might have seen the truth hidden in plain sight. Charles Hammond was not the successful businessman he claimed to be. He was a drifter, a con man, a man whose life was a patchwork of fraud, broken promises, and whispered scandals. Court records from towns scattered across the country told the real story. Fraud charges, property swindles, broken contracts. Each time, Charles slipped away with little more than a slap on the wrist. He was a master of reinvention, moving from state to state, leaving behind debts, shattered trust, and unanswered questions. And there were darker shadows in his past. In one case years earlier, dismembered remains had been discovered near a property linked to him. The investigation raised eyebrows, but never led to charges. In another, a young woman and her daughter disappeared after becoming entangled in his life. Once again, there was suspicion, but not enough proof. It was a pattern as chilling as it was maddening. Charles Hammond lived a life of slipping through the cracks, shielded by charm, luck, in a justice system unprepared to stop him. To Eleanor's family, her sudden disappearance made no sense. Letters stopped arriving. Phone calls went unanswered. When they reached out to Charles, his evasive responses only deepened the dread. But what could they do? In that era, missing adults were often written off as having left of their own free will. Police took down the reports, but saw no evidence of foul play. And so Eleanor's story was swallowed up by silence, even as her body lay nameless in Seabury. For Charles, life moved on with eerie ease. He continued his schemes, charming his way into new circles, conning new victims, leaving behind anyone who threatened to look too closely. Eleanor's name faded from memory, while Charles kept living in the open, a man with secrets buried deep beneath his polished surface. The dunes held their silence. The town whispered its theories, and the woman who had only wanted to belong remained an enigma for decades more. But the shadows of the past do not stay hidden forever. Charles Hammond was a man of many masks. To the untrained eye, he looked like a respectable gentleman, sharp suits, quick smile, a firm handshake. But peel away that polished veneer, and the truth was grotesque. His life was not one of success, but of manipulation, cruelty, and crime. Charles was born into instability. From his earliest years, he developed a talent for deception, learning how to charm teachers, neighbors, and later employers into believing he was more than he was. By the time he reached adulthood, conning people had become second nature. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, his name appeared in court dockets across multiple states. Fraud, theft, bad checks, property scams always small enough that a slick lawyer or a cooperative judge could turn prison time into a suspended sentence. His pattern was simple: arrive in a new town, find someone to trust him, extract money or property, and vanish before anyone could hold him accountable. Time after time, he left victims in his wake, families cheated out of their savings, landlords stuck with unpaid rent, employers swindled by false credentials. And yet, every time, he seemed to wriggle free. But Charles's greatest deception was not financial. It was personal. Women were drawn to him like moths to a flame. His charisma, his air of authority, his promises of adventure, they were intoxicating. Unfortunately, for many women, his love came at a devastating cost. In one chilling case years before Eleanor, Charles married a woman named Marion, a quiet widow with a young daughter. At first, he played the doting husband and father, presenting himself as a stable provider. But within months, both Marion and her child vanished. Neighbors raised alarms, but Charles claimed they had left suddenly to start fresh out west. When investigators searched his property, they made a gruesome discovery: human remains hidden in a septic tank. But the evidence was incomplete, badly degraded, and ultimately inconclusive. Without a body that could be identified or a clear line of proof, prosecutors' hands were tied. Charles walked free. This should have been the end of his freedom. This should have been the moment he was locked away for life. But instead, he moved on, marrying again, conning again, always with the same unnerving ease. By the late 1960s, Charles had perfected his craft. He was caught in yet another scheme, this time defrauding his wife's relatives out of thousands of dollars. At trial, he managed to spin a story of misunderstanding, convincing the court he had only been borrowing money. The judge gave him a suspended sentence in exchange for restitution. It was another chance squandered, another moment when society could have stopped him and didn't. Each brush with the law only seemed to embolden him. He learned how to play the system, when to feign remorse, when to lean on his charm, when to shift blame onto others. He knew exactly how to present himself to appear less dangerous than he truly was. And so the cycle repeated. Victims piled up, charges fizzled. Charles slipped away again and again. To those who knew him well, Charles's mask occasionally slipped. He was prone to violent outbursts, smashing objects in anger, screaming threats when he felt disrespected. There were whispers that he had struck women, terrified them into silence. But in an era when domestic abuse was often overlooked, those whispers rarely traveled beyond private walls. Police might be called, but reports were thin, evidence scarce, and officers reluctant to intervene in what they dismissed as family disputes. It was in this environment of neglect and systemic failure that Charles thrived. His violence could escalate unchecked, his crimes brushed aside, his secrets buried. By the time Charles met Eleanor Wilder, he was already a man with blood on his hands, even if no court had ever proven it. He was practiced, polished, and dangerous. For Eleanor, he seemed like a dream. For Charles, she was another possession, another conquest, another mark in a lifetime of deception. The tragedy was not just that Eleanor fell into his orbit. The tragedy was that she didn't have to. There had been so many opportunities to stop him, so many flashing warning signs ignored. Had the justice system acted when Marion and her daughter disappeared, Eleanor might never have crossed his path. Had the courts taken fraud and theft more seriously, Charles might have been behind bars instead of free to charm again. Had neighbors' suspicions been heeded, police might have uncovered his violence before it claimed more lives. But none of that happened. Instead, Charles Hammond lived on borrowed time, carrying his lies into the 1970s, where Eleanor's life would collide fatally with his. Looking back now, the picture is enraging. Charles wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't a genius who stayed ahead of investigators. He was sloppy, reckless, and often careless. His survival depended less on his cunning than on a system that consistently underestimated him. He was the kind of predator who thrives when no one is watching closely enough. A man who slipped through the cracks not because he was invisible, but because too many people chose not to look directly at him. And so, when Eleanor vanished after their honeymoon, it should have raised alarms. Instead, it barely registered. Charles returned in her car, offered half answers, and walked away untouched. Meanwhile, her body lay in the dunes, nameless, her story silenced, just another entry in Charles Hammond's long trail of destruction. But time has a way of dragging truth into the light, and nearly 50 years later, the silence of the dunes would be broken by science, persistence, and one final revelation. By the early 2000s, the case of the woman in the dunes had become almost myth. Generations of detectives had tried and failed. Tourists came to Seabury asking about the nameless grave, and locals recited the story like folklore. Some said she was cursed, others claimed her ghost haunted the shoreline. But in police headquarters, the case file remained. Dusty, worn, but never forgotten. In 2010, DNA technology had reached a level that older investigators could only dream of. Samples that had once seemed too degraded could now be extracted, analyzed, and compared. Across the country, old evidence boxes were being reopened, long cold cases thawing under the heat of modern science. For the woman in the dunes, her exhumed remains offered just enough material. A genetic profile was created and uploaded into national databases. At first, nothing came back. She wasn't in the system, and neither was her killer. Years passed again, but in 2019, something remarkable happened. A new technique, forensic genetic genealogy, began revolutionizing cold case investigations. By comparing DNA profiles to genealogical databases, investigators could trace distant relatives, sometimes to the point of identifying victims or even suspects. The team in Seabury decided to try. In 2021, the DNA yielded its first hit, a distant relative, several generations removed. From there, genealogists began painstakingly building a family tree, branch by branch, connecting the dots across decades of records. And finally, a name emerged. The woman in the dunes wasn't a spy. She wasn't a mob victim. She wasn't an heiress or a runaway. She was Eleanor Wilder, the woman who had once longed for love, who had married a man who promised her the world and gave her death instead. When detectives delivered the news to Eleanor's surviving relatives, the shock was overwhelming. For decades, they had lived without answers, wondering why she never called, never wrote, never came home. To learn she had been lying in an unmarked grave all this time was heartbreaking. But it was also a kind of release. She finally had her name back. But Eleanor's story was only half the revelation. The next question was obvious. Who killed her? The investigation turned back to the man who had last been seen with her, the husband who returned from their honeymoon driving her car, spinning conflicting stories. The man whose past was littered with fraud, disappearances, and suspected violence. Charles Hammond. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. He had motive, opportunity, and a documented history of manipulation and cruelty. Investigators pieced together witness accounts from the 1970s, court records from his earlier crimes, and the chilling details of his past marriages. Though Hammond had died years earlier, the district attorney's office announced their findings in 2022. Eleanor Wilder had been murdered by her husband, Charles Hammond. The case of the woman in the dunes was officially closed. For the people of Seabury, it was a moment of bittersweet closure. The nameless woman finally had her name restored. Her story was no longer just rumor and myth, it was truth carved in the record. But the announcement carried a heavy weight. It laid bare the failures of the past, the opportunities missed to stop a dangerous man. How many lives could have been spared if Hammond had been held accountable earlier? How many warnings had been ignored? How many victims silenced by charm and intimidation? For Eleanor's family, the answers were painful. They had found her, yes, but they had also uncovered the brutal reality of the man she had trusted. For investigators, it was a vindication of persistence and science, a reminder that even decades-old crimes can be solved. And for the rest of us, it was a lesson written in blood and sand. Predators thrive when society looks away. For nearly 50 years, the woman in the dunes was a ghost, a faceless presence haunting the shoreline, her story buried beneath waves and wind, whispered in rumors and half-believed legends. Now, with her name restored and her killer revealed, her silence has finally been broken. But the echoes of her story carry weight far beyond the dunes of Seabury. Eleanor Wilder was more than a mystery victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a woman with hopes of belonging, a woman who believed in love. The world reduced her to the woman in the dunes, as if her life began with death. But she had decades before that moments of laughter, of resilience, of longing. Restoring her name was not just about solving a case. It was about reclaiming her humanity, about giving her family the truth, and giving history a face to remember. Her grave, once marked only by a sterile inscription, unidentified female, now bears her true name. For the first time in decades, visitors come not to wonder who she was, but to mourn who she had been. But even as Eleanor's name was restored, the truth about Charles Hammond darkens the victory. Here was a man who lived his life as a predator in plain sight, a fraudster, a manipulator, a husband who became a killer. His crimes were not hidden in the shadows, they were right there, documented in court files, whispered by neighbors, hinted at in investigations. And yet, again and again, society chose not to see. He was given chance after chance, slaps on the wrist for fraud, shrugs from investigators when women in his orbit vanished, judges who treated him as a man who had lost his way rather than a man who had chosen cruelty as a way of life. If justice had done its job, Eleanor would still be alive. That is the bitter truth. Stories like Eleanor's force us to confront uncomfortable questions. How many victims vanish because systems fail to protect them? How many abusers are allowed to escalate because society dismisses warning signs as domestic disputes or personal matters? How many predators thrive not because they are brilliant, but because too many people look away? Charles Hammond was not a criminal mastermind. He was not invincible. He was simply relentless, and he benefited from a world that underestimated the danger of men like him. Eleanor's story is not just about her murder. It's about every moment when justice could have stopped it and didn't. When we think of unsolved murders, we often picture shadowy strangers, random acts of violence, mysteries too tangled to unravel. But more often than not, the danger comes from someone close, a partner, a spouse, a person who wears love as a mask while harboring violence beneath. That was Eleanor's tragedy. She sought belonging and found it in a man who only saw her as another possession to control. Her trust became her downfall. It is easy to say she should have known, but the truth is, predators like Charles thrive on charm. They thrive on presenting themselves as exactly what their victims long for. Blame does not belong to Eleanor. It belongs to the man who killed her and to the society that enabled him. In 2022, when the district attorney stood before cameras and declared the case closed, there was a sense of finality. But closure is complicated. For Eleanor's family, it was not a neat ending. It was the reopening of wounds that had never fully healed. Yet there is power in truth. Even if it comes late, even if justice cannot be served in a courtroom, truth itself is a form of justice. Eleanor is no longer forgotten. Her name is carved in stone, her story is known, and her killer has been unmasked for what he was. Not a man of charm, not a man of power, but a coward who built his life on lies. Picture the dunes of Seabury today. The wind still sweeps across the sand. Children still collect shells where Eleanor's body was found. Tourists still walk the shoreline, unaware of the history beneath their feet. But in the cemetery on the edge of town, the grave once marked unidentified female now bears a name. Flowers are left not for a stranger, but for Eleanor Wilder, a woman whose story is finally told. Her silence lasted 50 years, but silence does not erase truth. In the end, the dunes kept her secret until science, persistence, and time forced the earth itself to give her back. This was Criminal Minds Archives. Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling true crime stories.